Those of you who have heard me talk before, Bob is another informed voice about the grim realities that population's impact is having on our declining resources. But before I go on to introduce him, I'd like to introduce Alan Ware, who is Senior Research Associate at World Population Balance with me, and a member of our board, Flirty Ward, who is also retired from U.S. Bank, another U.S. Bank person, so I think she found several friends here in the audience today already. Bob Walker is president of the Population Institute based in Washington, D.C., where he directs the organization's advocacy and public education activities. He serves as chief spokesperson for the Institute, doing frequent interviews on radio and television, and he's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post. Bob is a member of the Washington, D.C. Rotary Club, and he received his BA in economics from Rockford College in Illinois and his JD from the University of Illinois Law School. And under a Rotary Graduate Fellowship, he attended the University of Sydney in Australia. Prior to joining the Population Institute 3 years ago, Bob was president of the Population Resource Center. And prior to that, he worked with other organizations in Washington for many years, beginning first with 14 years on Capitol Hill as a legislative aide for members of Congress on both sides of the political aisle. Ever since I was a page in the House of Representatives, I have been fascinated by how politics works behind the scenes. So a year ago, it was a treat for me when Bob painted a minute-by-minute picture of his involvement as a congressional lobbyist to successfully shepherd the assault weapons ban through Congress. One of the highlights was to hear him describe what happened when he needed to convince two former presidents, Reagan and Ford, to pick up the phone and call a member of Congress, because that member of Congress had said he would support the bill, vote for it, only if he received a phone call from each of those presidents. As a member of the Rotarian Action Group on Population, Bob is delivering this talk to several other Rotary clubs around the country. So please help me welcome Bob Walker to the finest podium in Minnesota.
It's a great pleasure to be here today. First of all, I love a Rotary Club with a view. And you have a great view. The Washington, D.C. Rotary Club really doesn't have a view. If you pull back the curtains in our room where we eat, you can see up close and personal the Russian embassy, complete with antennas and listening devices. So we have to advise our public speakers to be careful not to reveal any national secrets. Anyway, no, it's a great pleasure to be here, particularly with Dave, who is a dear friend and colleague, and I have great respect for the work he's done over the years. And I want to thank you, Sharon, for this invitation. It's very much appreciated. The topic of my talk today is population. The world is 7 billion. But it's really not about the number 7 billion or even numbers at all. I like to say that population is really about people, posterity, and the planet. And when I think about population, I oftentimes think about this picture. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a picture of an elderly woman in South Sudan. And when I think about population, I think about what kind of future her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren are going to have. And I always try to keep her face in mind and people's face in mind, because that's what it really comes down to. Because when it comes to population, it's not about how many people the world can contain, it's about how many people the earth can sustain. And in what standard of living, and for how long. A year ago, on October 31st, world population officially crossed the 7 billion mark. Now, there's nothing magical about 7 billion, it's just a number. But it is a milestone, and milestones offer us an opportunity for reflection. So what we did at the Population Institute was we said, well, let's take a look back to October of 1999, which happened to be when world population crossed the 6 billion threshold. And we started to do a look back into history at what has changed in the world in the last 12 years. And what we discovered was really quite profound. That's the copy of our report. By the way, there's a one-pager on your table which summarizes the report. But when we look back to October of 1999, what I sensed when I read papers going back to that period, this was a period of great hope. We were just weeks away from the millennial celebrations, I'm sure you recall that. And we were looking back on a really miraculous century. A century where, despite a Great Depression and 2 world wars, humanity had taken a great leap forward. During the 20th century, population rose from 1.6 billion to 6 billion, a quadrupling of population. Life expectancy of birth in the 20th century more than doubled. The world's per capita income and wealth soared in the 20th century. Income went from an average of $850 per person in 1900 to $175 in the year 2000. It was indeed a different world at that time. And as I went back and took a look at the research, I remember we were making great strides in reducing severe poverty. And in 1999, there were many, many statements made about how we were on the verge of ending world hunger. Energy was cheap. Oil, at one time in 1999, was $13 a barrel. And The Economist magazine ran a front page story, now an infamous story, about the era of cheap oil is here to stay. And in 1999, there were no apparent limits to growth. Yes, we were using more natural resources, but the prices, commodity prices of metals and minerals and other commodities for several decades, indeed almost throughout the entire century, had been in decline. So much for concerns about limits to growth. We had more mouths to feed, but the price of basic food commodities, grain, cooking oils, those things had been in decline for several decades. There was concern about climate change back in 1999, but the ink on the Kyoto Protocol was still wet, and their hopes were high that the nations of the earth would come together in an effort to restrict greenhouse gas emissions. World population was still growing, but birth rates were falling. And many demographers were saying that world population within a matter of 3 to 4 decades would begin to decline. And there were concerns about what was called the global birth dearth. Okay, that was 1999. I want to fast forward to where we were on October of last year when world population crossed the 7 million marks. And of all the things that I think perhaps struck me most when I went back to that period and looked at that 12-year period, what had happened, was that in the last 10 years, the price of basic food commodities around the world had more than doubled. The prices of wheat, rice, corn, of cooking oils, and other basic commodities, ICE says nearly, it's been more than double. It's an increase of 110%. We've seen a very dramatic shift. I'm sorry you really can't see this chart in detail, but again, what you see throughout the 20th century was a decline or a plateauing of basic commodity prices for fuel and non-fuel commodity prices alone. But when we came into the 21st century, suddenly prices soared dramatically. In fact, for metals and minerals, what we've seen, and this is a somewhat dated chart, we've seen actually in the last 10 years increases of 200, 300% for virtually all the metals and minerals in the commodity markets. And what has happened is that the ranks of the hungry have increased in the last 12 years. That was a result of high food prices and 2 world food crises. We have seen increases in the number of hungry in the world rather than the hopes that we were going to have or even eliminate poverty. Greenhouse gas emissions since the year 2000 have gone up with the exception of 1 year continually. There is no sign of any let up in greenhouse gas emissions. And rising population projections. Birth rates are still falling, fertility rates are still falling, but they're no longer falling as fast as projected, and now population projections are rising. And where at one time, there was talk about a global birth dearth, that talk has gone away. The latest UN projections show no indication that population growth will decline through the end of this century at any time. We will continue to grow, and I'll talk more about that later in a second. But perhaps one of the more significant things that's occurred is that the global decline in adolescent pregnancy rates, which we saw in the 20th century, has basically stalled out. And when you look at the least developed countries in the world today, we find that adolescent pregnancy rates, in fact, are on the rise, which is a very disturbing trend for the very poorest countries in the world. There are many reasons for high adolescent pregnancy rates, but chief among them, I believe, is that there has been a decline in international family planning assistance from the U.S. and other donors, including foundations, over the last 12 years. In addition to that, as we look at fertility rates and whether population will continue to decline, one of the most significant factors is that in countries where population growth rates are still high, child marriage is very prevalent. And let me indicate what I mean by child marriage. In many countries, for example, in rural Yemen, girls are married off at the age of 8 or 9 years of age. And that's true in many parts of northern India, it's true in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And that is, of course, a major contributor to the increase in the adolescent pregnancy rate. I want to talk now about the challenges that we face in the future. Right now, scientists indicate that we are already exceeding planetary boundaries. We are using more of the world's natural resources, the renewable resources, than the Earth can regenerate sustainably. And the latest indications are that by the year 2030, we will need 2 planets to sustain us in the long run. Of course, we don't have 2 planets. And if everyone in the world were to live an American lifestyle, we would need 5 planets to sustain us. But we don't have, of course, 5 planets. What we do have in the world today is a growing concern about a shortage of arable land. Since the 1970s, the amount of land devoted to agriculture, arable land, that has expanded and being used has grown by about 5%. And the remaining arable land in the world today is primarily forest, and most of that is tropical forest. And in addition to that, we find out that biofuels are increasingly competing with agricultural production for that arable land. And now, you've read the story, we're in the midst of a worldwide or international land grab where countries and corporations are going into Ethiopia and many parts of sub-Saharan Africa and buying up marginal arable land, taking it away from the existing farmers, sold by the government, and they go in and establish their own producing and ship the crops back to their home country. We have water scarcity. Water scarcity has already reached crisis proportion in many parts of Central Asia and in many parts of North Africa. Demand for water is expected to exceed supplies by 40% within the next 20 years. A recent study said, put it in more graphic terms, that when you look at the demand for water, fresh water, we are going to need the equivalent of the annual flow of 20 Nile rivers in the next 20 years. But we don't have those rivers. Loss of topsoil. The FAO estimates that by 2030, 135 million people may lose their land as a result of soil degradation, including 60 million in sub-Saharan Africa alone. Rising energy prices. We've had a boost in non-conventional oil production, shale gas, and that's certainly been a boon for the United States and for the world economy. But all the energy experts say that world energy prices are going to continue to climb in the decades ahead.